Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video. Ito Takeo provided a first-hand account of his experiences and observations in Manchuria in his memoir, Life Along the South Manchurian Railway, The Memoirs of Ito Takeo. He later became a general in the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II, highlighting his influential role within the military and, presumably, his involvement in Japanese imperial expansion efforts. In addition to his military career, he reflected on his youth, travels, and experiences with the South Manchurian Railway, or SMR, which was instrumental in Japan's colonization and industrialization of Manchuria. In July of 1917, Ito Takeo and several high school classmates used their last summer vacation to take a trip throughout China. Before returning to Japan, their final stop was the port city of Darren, at the southernmost tip of the Liaodong Peninsula. It is here that Takeo focused on the industrial and agricultural development of Manchuria and the South Manchurian Railway's role in the region. He noted that the factories we observed were, of course, managed by the SMR, as was the restaurant within the park where we escaped from our chaperones. Electricity, gas, waterworks, all had the SMR markings on them. In our youthful minds, the SMR was merely a railway company, and we completely misunderstood its real character. However, Ito's account took place in a country already undergoing rapid economic transformation under Japanese colonial stewardship, and he happened to fixate on a few key elements. Manchuria was an outlet for Japanese imperial expansion, encompassing its commerce, government, and economy, both as a periphery far from the Japanese home islands, but also as a heartland to be exploited. The city of Darren alone was composed of a myriad of institutions and services constructed by the SMR, including utilities, hospitals, schools and universities, laboratories, sewage systems, parks, and public squares. These hallmarks bear an almost mirrored essence of European city planning and were relatively new during the Russian Dolny period before it became Darren after the Japanese takeover. The Russo-Japanese War ended with Russia ceding the Chinese Eastern Railway to Japan, which then renamed it the South Manchurian Railway in 1906. The SMR linked large swaths of rural Manchuria to economic centers such as Darren, and between 1906 and 1931, the increased Japanese commercial interests and influence brought about rapid industrial and economic change. In the Mukden incident of September 1931, Kwangtung soldiers staged an incident of sabotage on the rail line in Mukden, modern-day Shenyang, to legitimize their military expansion and government takeover through the establishment of the Manchukuo puppet government. This event marked the SMR officially as a state-building institution, and with supportive aid from the Kwangtung military, industrial development and commerce became the overriding prerogatives. Imperial Japan set out to expand and expedite Manchuria's industrialization, not only to grow its economy, but to reap the rewards of colonial wealth, much like their colonial contemporaries in the West, such as England, the United States, and the newly established Soviet Union. Japanese economic policy extended into a few key areas, and as the initial specialization in agriculture and traditional financial sectors evolved, this provided the base for extensive investments later in heavy industry. As a result, Manchurian industry and its economy were shaped by an educated Japanese managerial and civil servant class who planned to exploit cheap Chinese labor for the construction of state-building superstructures. At the turn of the 20th century, the Manchurian agricultural sector was significantly underdeveloped, and under the Qing government, settlement of the area remained limited and tightly controlled. Despite aggressive tax policies by the Qing governor-generals and later local warlords, Chinese settlers, legal or otherwise, began moving into the region and forming pockets of agricultural and economic guilds. They developed close-knit regional trade networks and progressively shifted their agricultural products from subsistence farming to cash crops, such as millet, Kiaoliang sorghum, and soybeans. Farmers increasingly became enmeshed in a trade network consisting of agricultural middlemen, major brokers at collection centers, and exporters or producers of intermediary goods. After the handover from Russia, the economy grew and agricultural production expanded thanks to the introduction of new technologies such as fertilizer, crop specialization, and the progressive shift to an export economy. When the Kwangtung Army later invaded and occupied the Liaodong Peninsula and northern Manchuria, these economic networks were typically centered around county seats of regional administration, which was conducive to centralized control. The Kwangtung Railway economic zone increased demand for Chinese day laborers and factory workers and began shifting the primarily agrarian economy into a behemoth of heavy industry situated along the South Manchurian Rail line. Ito's initial impressions of Darren had occurred long after SMR and colonizing Japanese forces had become established in Manchuria. The introduction of Japanese rail networks drastically increased market globalization and trade following the Russo-Japanese War. Japanese banks, textiles, and most importantly, heavy industry and rail became crucial focal points of Japanese economic policy. Political ideas from the post-Meiji modernization bled into economic policy and supported the creation of firms such as the Zaibatsu conglomerates and special companies such as the SMR in key industries such as mining, coal, steel, timber, banking, and chemicals. Interestingly, Japan remained one of the few imperial powers to locate heavy industry in its colonies, and Manchukuo is an extreme example of this policy. Comparatively, the Taiwan colony was only prepared for industrialization towards the end of the colonial period, whereas Manchukuo's industrial transformation was expedited to serve Japan's need for self-sufficiency and its expansionist policy throughout Southeast Asia. As production levels increased, so did reliance on the rail systems, factory and agricultural labor, investments, investors, and key research conducted by the SMR. The Army's occupation aimed to direct and control heavy industrial development, marshaling resources in preparation for a possible conflict with the Soviet Union. Research teams at the SMR employed individuals such as Miyazaki Masayoshi to emulate Soviet state capitalist developmental methods. Miyazaki was a prominent expert at the SMR and was well versed in Soviet industrial planning and policy due to his education at the University of St. Petersburg. In 1937, the Manchukuo government utilized the 5-year plan devised by Miyazaki to expand iron and steel production in cooperation with Zaibatsu conglomerates such as Nissan. The economic benefits of this new industrial growth were not shared equally by those engaged in it, but distributed unequally to landowning classes and management. Chinese farmers, factory workers, and day laborers who comprised the bulk of the labor force were largely excluded from the economic benefits they created. There is even evidence of forced labor and prisoners of war being employed in enterprises such as Nissan's Showa Steelworks. With financial backing from Japanese banks and monetary policy driven by the desire to grow Manchuria's industrial sector, the purely capitalist profit motive was discarded in favor of sheer production capacity. The SMR and the Kwangtung government employed educated university students like Miyazaki and Ito Takeo to become the Japanese managerial class, civil servants, or researchers, and they were largely employed by the Zaibatsu or the SMR to foster the development of the colonial nation-state of Manchuria. These individuals would become the vanguard of the state-building project to solidify Manchuria as a Japanese colony. Separated from the Chinese peasantry, the educated classes were to emulate what Goto Shinpei referred to as military preparedness in civil garb. By hiring educated Japanese university graduates, Shinpei reasoned that this method, which had worked to some success in Taiwan, could also be used during his presidency at the SMR. Gotou's policies were rooted in European scientific theory, social and cultural research, which emphasized capital export via rail. To him, the state, and particularly cultural institutions such as banks, schools, and hospitals, were designed to create a colonial dependency on the imperial core. 2 years after Gotou left the company, his policies continued to manifest in the SMR's socioeconomic research, colonial policy, and industrial planning in the Manchurian colony. However, as the industrial infrastructure became more of a critical component for the Army, certain groups in the social science sections of the SMR Research Department were less willing to support the Army's desire for colonial longevity. Scholars unwilling to provide the required support were imprisoned, tortured, transferred, or exiled from Manchukuo. Ito dubbed this the suppression of science, and while he personally escaped with only short-term imprisonment, many of his peers and colleagues were not as fortunate. When Ito's work no longer supported the long-term goals and objectives of the Imperial Japanese government to enforce colonial control in Manchuria, the systems he had established were cast aside as no longer being useful.